Welcome back. You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham. And we've reached a really glorious part in the story. This little episode is more of a scene setter, of background to a remarkable encounter. Enjoy, and if you want to engage more in conversation about Patriarch, do visit the Facebook group Bible Novels or the website biblenovels.com. Do tell your friends about it too. It would be wonderful to share this amazing story with as many people as we possibly can. Patriarch, Chapter 5, Part 1. Sarai looked her 90 years. The last 13 had been the longest. Largely futile and intolerably lonely, they had taken their toll on her. The shadows of life had lengthened rapidly, as they tend to do in the twilight. And now it wasn't just her hair which was grey, but also her complexion, which had so recently been sunny, her dress, which had become increasingly drab, and especially her mood. The joy and warmth was gone. Laughter remained, but it was no longer carefree and out loud as a result of a lightness of spirit, but it was cynical and inward as an expression of the growing darkness of her soul. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. The warmth and glow between Abram's, Hagar, and herself had grown cold as they moved apart. Now all that remained of the fire were a few dying embers, and soon they would be snuffed out too. Then nothing would remain. At least not for her. Hagar and Abram's intimacy would always remain, embodied in the child which would forever torment Sarai. That is why she sought so hard to avoid Ishmael. She feared him and hated him. It was crazy. He was just a child, but yet so much more. He reminded her of her failure. Through him, Hagar would live on when the maidservant died, whereas she would just die. And so she hid from him, a noble woman, scared of a little innocent child. But then again, there was little innocent about him. He knew the power he had over her, and he knew how to exercise it, which was why she was so particularly scared of him and why she so reviled him. A chance meeting and a thrown glance could traumatize her for days. And so she hid from him, finding sanctuary in the private world of her tent. Day after day she would spend there, week after week, month after month, year after year. Her space adjoined the rear of Abram's tent, and so from here she could keep up with the comings and goings and developments of life without the need for any further interaction. Sometimes she would go to Abram, and occasionally he would come to her, but their exchanges were largely devoid of intimacy or passion. Not that it seemed to bother him. For him, life went on. For him, there was purpose. For him, there was a future, an inheritance, a lineage. She found herself resenting his busyness, his reputation, his very personality. All those things previously in which she'd taken pride were now becoming the cause of her bitterness, and she hated herself for this, and him for that. And so it went on and on, for 13 weary years. The only consolation being found in the undemanding routine. Sarai tried to persuade herself that the anonymity of the mundane was preferable to the hard expectations of faith and hope. But it appeared that such choices weren't going to be hers to make. She'd caught the incident between the father and son and had quietly enjoyed Abram's obvious distress. For just a moment she felt good that the boy could cause him pain too, and that Abram's life wasn't just a triumphal procession without her. Oh, but only for a moment. Then her love kicked in again. 13 years of awkwardness couldn't deny the love. And Sarai hated herself for hating him. She wanted to go to him to bring him peace, like she had so many times before, far too long ago. And she would have done. So profound was this moment of need and desire. Oh, it could have been the turning point in their lives and relationship. But then someone else got in first. Sarai was stopped before she even moved towards Abram's tent by the voice. Immediately her heart sank as she realized the moment was lost, a moment which might not come again for a while. But then something strange happened to her heart. It calmed, it warmed, it quickened. It soared like it hadn't done for such a very long time. She couldn't hear what the mysterious visitor was saying. It was as though he was whispering. And yet her heart responded to it. Whatever was being said, she knew it was significant, and not just for Abram, but for her too. More significant still, she realized she knew the speaker. It wasn't his voice which gave him away. She'd never heard that. It was the impact of his presence. She'd sensed it once before when he met with Abram. Oh, it was a long time ago, but she would never forget it. Now more than ever she wanted to go to him, but she knew she shouldn't, and so she waited her turn, patiently, for a turn which wasn't to come. For when her heart told her that the Lord had gone, she waited just a short while longer out of respect for what had just taken place, and maybe too out of fear for what might be about to happen, only to find she waited too long. Abram had gone. Whatever had been said had spurred him into action, and once more she was left behind. And yet it was strange, because she knew she wouldn't be left out. The peace that had come upon her as the Lord had come hadn't left her as he had left. Something profound had happened, and destiny was being worked out. Still, she feared destiny, because it was always so demanding, so impossible, so cruelly uncompromising. And yet, deep down, she supposed she still knew that it was better to have had a hard call than no call at all. As she waited, she became aware of a strange atmosphere coming over the camp. She couldn't work out whether it was excitement or fear, or both. It was incomprehensible. And it was only slowly she realised why. Something was being asked of the camp which they themselves didn't understand, but out of commitment to their Lord they would submit to in any case. Oh, would that faith could be that simple for her too. Would that she could just believe and submit. Faith which asked for a physical response was easy and could even be ignorant. Faith which asked for a response of the heart and mind could only be total. Her circumcision asked too much of her. It cut through to her very heart, and of herself she knew she hadn't the strength to allow this. So she retreated to her tent, where at least the frenzy and noise of the camp was hidden and muffled, and there she sank down on her mat and sneered inwardly at her twin curse, frailty of womb and frailty of heart. And as she did, she spiraled back down again from the heights to which the visitor had inspired her, down to the pit of despair in which she'd lived for so long. She laughed, a sad, dark laugh. She was a sick joke, useless, a princess. She hadn't heard him enter. She hadn't felt him enter. Such was her present state, but the name broke the dam. She hadn't heard it spoken for so long, and had never heard it spoken like that. Slowly she turned, hesitant in case somehow the voice was in her head and not real. But there he stood, as he hadn't stood in 13 years or maybe ever. There was a dignity, a glory even about him, which demanded reverence. He wasn't the same. He was somehow loftier, and to a degree at least, as he was, so she was too. For a while they stood looking at one another, as if to read all the emotions of 13 lost years. Then in a hushed tone, Abraham whispered again, "Sarah, my princess." At which Sarah fell at his knees and hung on to them for all she was worth, because here at least she had worth. And if only here, then that was enough. She was his princess again. And yet she was to realize she was much, much more. No longer was this to be a private and intimate term of endearment between two aging lovers, but now it was her name, her title, and her public identity. One thing, though, Sarah had come to realize over the years was that when God spoke, you may change, but life didn't. In fact, often it just got tougher. She wasn't alone in recognizing how God had touched her husband. The camp now called him Abraham, exalted father, which was an honor for him and a challenge to her. If Abraham's physical fatherhood was exalted, this was through Hagar and Ishmael, not her. And if it was to be exalted further, it could only now be through someone other. Where previously her bearing a child was unlikely, now it was impossible. The intimacy she and Abraham had rediscovered did not extend to the marriage bed, and it had been many years since she last bled. The promises had withered with her womb, and both now rang hollow, let down by each other. Many people may have wondered at her new lease of life, but then, before most people, a heartache expressed by an inner cry or laugh come to that could be covered up. Not before everyone, though. It was just a few weeks later, and Sarah found refuge and solitude in her tent, even in the middle of the day. Here she could relax without pretense or fear. For his part, Abraham, although he now spent more time with Sarah, couldn't bear the oppressive stuffiness of the tent in the heat of the midday sun, and sought sanctuary just outside, in the entrance to his tent, where he could rest in the shade while enjoying the slightest of refreshing breezes. He loved to sit here looking out over the view he knew so well. This was the nearest the wanderer had to a home. The old trees of Mamre stood in front of him, unchanged from how they stood 20 years before when he first encountered them, and who knew how long before then. Oh, so much had happened beneath their boughs, and as Abraham drifted blissfully back and forth between the conscious and the unconscious, he dreamed and remembered. He recalled meeting his friends for the first time, Mamre and his brothers Eskol and Anna. He remembered those 17 years ago, sitting with them beneath the trees, planning their one and only battle. He remembered the times they'd sat together in the shade of the trees since then, less purposefully, but so enjoyably, and he hoped his friends might come again, unbidden as they did, to talk and drink and eat, but mainly just to sit. As Abraham sat on his mat, his head rocked up and down, it slumped as sleep prevailed and rose up again when some stimulus awoke his senses. He was carefree and careless about whether he slept or woke. Oh, it was a good state to be in. Whenever his head rose, he would take the opportunity to look up, and if all was well and unchanged, he would happily yield to sleep once more, until on one stirring he looked up to see 3 figures in the distant haze. Oh, midday sun or no midday sun, the old man sprang to life, maybe a little too quickly, without giving his head or eyes a chance to adjust. He stumbled towards his friends in anticipation of the most pleasant of afternoons in their company. He squinted at them through the fierce sunlight as he went, and only slowly became aware that these were not his friends. His disappointment, though, was only momentary, and his pace didn't slacken. Still, he couldn't see clearly or recognise them for who they were, but what he could discern was that these were no ordinary travellers, and when he reached them, the Patriarch and exalted father found himself obliged to bow low to the ground. Looking up at them, Abraham still couldn't recognise them, and yet knew that it was right he honoured them by coming and bowing before them. To all intents and purposes, they were ordinary men, simply dressed, hot, dirty, and evidently thirsty, just like any other men would have been. And yet they were different. The 2 to either side were somehow other than men, although Abraham couldn't fathom what he meant by this, while the one in the middle was somehow more of a man than any he'd ever met before. Although, again, Abraham couldn't work out how he knew this. It was the one in the middle he addressed. Adonai. He had never before called any man that, not even the man-god Pharaoh. If I have found favour in your eyes, do not pass your servant by. Abraham felt his heart raise. This was more than an offer of customary hospitality to the weary traveller who'd been on the road since dawn and who'd earned the right of rest with whoever he happened to meet at midday. Abraham wanted this strangely familiar stranger to stay. He began to plan in his mind how that afternoon would go. Let a little water be brought, and then you can wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you've come to your servant. For a moment the 3 seemed undecided as they looked at one another, and then, matter-of-factly, without any expression of particular enthusiasm or appreciation, they responded, 2 sharing the sentence between them, and the 3rd nodding his agreement. Very well. Do as you say. Abraham settled the men beneath the tree and then sped back to his tent as his mind raced over all that needed to be done. It was never his intention to give a little water or something to eat. It was more of a feast he had in mind, and he planned it as he ran through his tent and into Sarah's. Quick, he said, without apology for startling his aged wife and without pausing for breath. Get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread. He spoke on the run through the tent and on out of the entrance the other side without waiting for a response to what was in any case an order and not a request. On he went, a little breathless now, and more than a little sweaty in the heat, out of the camp and on a little distance to the herds. Most of the herdsmen were dozing in the shadows and were ill prepared for their patriarch to come racing across the scorching dirt like a madman. One was alert enough to stagger to his feet as Abraham approached and was whisked off for his troubles into the midst of the livestock, being asked over and over again as he was carried along where the best calf could be found. The herdsman had no idea what was going on, but he did know where the choicest and most tender calves were penned, and he scurried along with his master to where they were. On arrival at the pen, the first time, Abraham faltered and deliberated. Whatever the hurry, the selection of the calf was important enough to linger over, and the servant couldn't help but notice the choice was expert indeed. By now, although still unaware of what the urgency might be, he'd managed all the same to pick up its scent, and when Abraham left him to prepare the calf, he himself had hurried into action. Sarah, too, had caught the mood, although unaware of the occasion, and set to preparing bread despite the unusual hour. Ordinarily, this was a morning task. But even without the opportunity to ask, she'd become very aware that that morning's bread was not going to be fresh enough or good enough for whoever had arrived in the camp. She had time to ponder who it might be as she prepared the fire. Oh, she hoped it wasn't Lot. As the coals heated, she mixed her finest flour with water into dough and formed them into cakes, and a lot of them at that. Too many just for Lot. This was a small company who'd come, small but important for this treatment. The coals had heated the ground by now, so she swept them away and placed the bread on the hearth. And then she covered them in embers to bake them slowly and expertly. Meanwhile, Abraham returned to his guests and personally washed their feet. Of course, his servants could have done this, but only he felt able to serve these men. He offered them camel's milk as they waited for the meat to cook and for themselves to be rested enough to enjoy it. He deliberated over how to prepare and present it, or with more time he would have roasted such beautiful meat, but with this limited notice he chose instead to have it cut into small pieces and broiled on skewers. These pieces could then be served with bread and dipped into butter. The result was excellent, and he was more than satisfied, as he knew his guests would soon be too. As his guests ate, Abraham stood a discreet distance apart under a neighbouring tree, ready to respond servant-like to any additional requests they might have. No one else, though, ventured near. Strangers were always welcomed into the camp and treated as honoured guests, not just because custom dictated it, but because this camp knew better than most what it meant to be wanderers in need of hospitality. These strangers, though, were evidently very special. Normally travellers were humbly offered bread and water, and all were always surprised by what they actually received. On occasions, though, they were very surprised. Sometimes a succulent spiced kid or lamb would be served to a particularly honoured guest, and to be honest, the camp were wealthy enough to afford this affluence and generosity, and so felt nothing but pride in the appreciation of their guests. But today was different. These guests merited more. A calf, and more than that too, the very best calf, served by the Patriarch himself. Such guests, whoever they were obviously of a rank and stature far beyond a humble camp follower, and so the guests ate undisturbed, although not unobserved or unheard. As they ate, they talked. And afterwards they talked some more over another serving of camel's milk, this time offered to settle stomachs by now full of rich fare. Abraham listened and spoke when addressed, and all the time sought clues to substantiate the craziest of thoughts concerning the lead guest's identity. After a while there was a pause in conversation like any other, except this one seemed planned. It appeared a cue, an agreed sign that the time had come. And when one broke the silence, he evidently spoke for them all.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.